So, hi, Miguel.
I am.
Again. I have been tasked by the people who give money to us for being here to say that one of the reasons we're chatting today is that in a week you'll be presenting at the Skirball Theater, the North American premiere of This Concerns All of Us, Cela Nous Concerne Tous, which is a piece that you created in 2018 at the Ballet de Lorraine in France.
17.
17.
Yes.
17. The talk is also curated by dance theorist Noémie Solomon, so kudos to her, and paid for by the Villa Albertine, which is financed by the French State Department, and so is part of French imperial soft power. Here we are held by that and in a multi-billionaire company called Zoom to meet for the first time, which is a particular ground to meet on, but that's what we have. It's still a pleasure to meet you within this fraught context. What do you think, Miguel? Should we say a word about who we are, where we're speaking from geographically, and maybe a little description of the background, visually speaking, in terms of accessibility of the image?
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
If you want to go.
Sure. My name is Miguel Gutierrez. I am the person who made the piece you just named, Cela Nous Concerne Tous. This concerns all of us. I make dances and performances. I make music. I write. I also now make drawings. I teach. That's a big part of my identity as well. I teach at UCLA. I still live in New York as well. But right now I'm in Boulder, Colorado, in the sort of western part of the United States, or the area we refer to right now as the United States. And I'm working with students here. I'm making a new work with them. I'm also doing a lot of teaching as well, just nonstop teaching. And doing these kind of Zoom meetings. I think that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Could you describe your environment?
Oh, my environment. Thank you. So I'm in a hotel room. So I myself, just for like audio description purposes, I'm a 51-year-old bearish queer gay man boy trapped in this body. Celebrating in this body. Salt and pepper hair, and light-skinned Latino or Latinx person. I'm wearing a white T-shirt that says "Protect Trans Kids" on it. I'm in a hotel room, sitting on my bed, so that I get the light coming towards me to be flattering, washing me in a white, or sort of like a glow up. And I'm just in this very kind of like generic hotel room. It's a nice hotel room actually, as they go, but it's a little dark because it's on the first floor. So yeah, that's where I am.
Thanks. I find that settling to have a physical description of what is happening.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm Emma Bigé. I'm a cultural and text worker, I guess, working in the field of dance and queer theory. I study, write, and translate for the most part, experimental improvisational dance forms, and articulate them with queer and trans ecologies. I am speaking from my living room. Behind me, there are stacks of books and a window with a leafy tree and the sun peering out. My skin is pale pink. I'm wearing a dark red lipstick, blue earrings, and a blue scarf on my head, and a pink sort of overcoat. Geographically, I'm in my home in rural France, where I live as part of a constellation of dancers and farmers and builders who live together near a dance studio in the National Park of Périgord Vert. It's not I'm taken by the land acknowledgement practice in America, and often when I try to think of myself in Europe, I cannot say that it's a occupied territory per se, but I know that the place I am in is protected by virtue of the fact that France is occupying other territories or has occupied other territories across the globe, in Africa, in Asia, and in the Americas. So that's where I stand. Voilà. I say all this to situate where I am, but also as a sort of a ground for the starter question around the piece that you made, which was commissioned in this country, not far from where I am. So it's titled "This Concerns All of Us," and it's a piece that you made in direct reference to the May 68 revolt in France, which the France was celebrating the 50th anniversary of when you were making the piece. And so the piece features a soundscape of the movement. We can hear revolutionary call to arms for the general strike in the piece, etc. And so that would be sort of the first question: is how did you come about working on that specific political archive, and how do you feel this related at the time and relates now to the political French and American contexts that you were in?
Yeah, when I first spoke with Petter and Tom, and they proposed the commission, they pointed out that it was going to be the 50-year anniversary season of the company, that the company had been founded around the same time of this event in France, and then also pointed out that it was going to share a bill in France. It's not doing this in the US, but sharing a bill with Merce Cunningham's piece Rainforest, which also premiered in 1968. And I just bing bing bing, 68 France, like I just knew the most bare minimum about that experience or time. And so I did a little bit of a dive into some history, and then I found this really beautiful William Klein film about the protests. That is kind of like it's a very William Klein kind of approach to documentary, where there's not really like a kind of simple narrative or explicatory narrative happening about the protests, but more kind of a wash of images and clips from people in rooms yelling, and the occupation of the Odeon Theater. And I think that particular image of the Odeon Theater really struck me, because then when I went to visit Nancy the first time to meet the company in the summer of 2017, we went to the L'Opéra National de Lorraine, where the piece was going to premiere. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really an intense context. Like a freaking opera house. So I thought a lot about how I felt about that. And I felt both very lucky, to know that I was going to be in this beautiful space, but also it's such a particularly strange kind of a room. It's not a kind of context that I work in very much. So that kind of stayed with me. And then, obviously the French have a very long history of protest and kind of active relationship to it. And we do as well in the United States, although we don't have the sort of strike energy that France has, where there's the same level of ferociousness around protection of workers. I feel like here that's a lot more tricky. The energy that we have here has been, civil rights oriented, and unfortunately, also there's a lot of energy in right wing circles. So I have a relationship to protest because when I was 19 years old, I spent about a year of my life living in San Francisco, doing a lot of protests with Queer Nation San Francisco, which was a sort of anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia activist group. And that was also 1991. So then the Gulf War, the US's involvement in the Gulf War. So I was going to a lot of anti-war protests, and have gone to many anti-war protests since. So I also was thinking about the kind of choreography of protest and the sort of tension between order and disorder, and I don't like to invoke this word really, but like chaos, but I don't mean it in a cheesy way, but just the sort of multi-sensory activity that happens when a certain idea about the way things are gets flipped. So I think that's kind of what was on my mind.
It's interesting that you should mention the Queer Nation protest, because one of the things that I was thinking, especially with the title, this concerns all of us, and what I thought when I heard the title was, oh, if it needs to be said, it's probably not yet the case that it does concern all of us, and probably there's aspect of that revolution of the 1968 that left a lot of people on the side. And I was specifically thinking of the Front Révolutionnaire, le Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire, the homosexual front of liberating action, liberative action, which was born out of 68, but emerged in the 70s, 71. So from the lack of involvement with these questions. And similarly, you could say that a lot of decolonial movement in the, in the French metropolis had been forgotten by that movement, by that moment of revolution. So I was thinking, it's interesting that your culture come from the queer nation, and another form of practicing protest that also involves other form of somatic engagements with protesting that might invoke tenderness, might invoke acts of intimacy in public as a form of protest, as a form of vandalism of the public space. Sorry.
No, I just want to, first I want to map that a very similar thing happened in the US. I mean, we don't have we had other protests going on. Obviously, there were protests many places in the 60s, but post Stonewall, you have the emergence of the Gay Liberation Front, which is almost exactly the same name, right? Which in its inception, my understanding is GLF was much more countercultural, much more intersectional, revolutionary minded, Marxist influenced. It was really thinking about culture in a broad sense, right? And there's a constant sort of, I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, but there's a sort of line that's often sort of mapped that the Gay Liberation Front started as this kind of revolutionary organization, and then we end up with gay marriage, like the most sort of kind of this kind of assimilationist gesture that that occurs throughout the sort of trajectory of queer or gay activism in the United States, and that those tensions are always kind of happening, right? And those tensions are at play throughout the left, obviously, in many ways. It's like either people of color mess up the alleged sort of clarity of a certain direction. It's like, oh wait, we have to deal with racism, or queer people mess up the clarity of a certain mission. It's like these different left movements are not able to hold within themselves the clarity of what this really means to include everyone, what it means to affect everyone, right? So that is something that is a kind of education that I witnessed firsthand, in the early 90s in San Francisco. That was exactly, those tensions were still there. And I saw them play out in ACT UP. There were people in ACT UP who were not happy about having to talk about sexism and racism. They were like, no, we want to talk about HIV and that's it. And it's like, well, you kind of can't talk about anything medical if you're not willing to talk about these other things. So that created a rupture there. So I think that that's kind of always been in my, it's been in my awareness, right? And And certainly, even when I was in France working on the piece, I thought about how France is, or my experiences in France is that there's a real lack of ability to talk about race.
Mhm, mhm.
And there's a sort of fiction of the République, like this like one encompassing idea of a citizenry that is just united, and we don't have to talk about race, or we don't have to classify, we don't have to know how many people of color there are in the country when we do the census. And coming from my perspective, that feels quite bizarre. Um, that there's that kind of willful ignorance in like disguised as some sort of like progressivism. So yeah, that kind of came into the room when we
Mm.
were talking a little bit as well. Yeah.
You talk about it a little bit in this article paper that you wrote. Does abstraction belong to white people? This
Yeah.
moment where you put
Yeah.
the question of race in the room, which creates incomprehension, tensions, etc. And I
Yeah.
wondered how that, because the piece is about something else that is important, but I wonder how that factored in the way you composed the piece, how the overwhelmingly white
Yeah.
cast of the Ballet de Lorraine, representing all of us, um, asks a question or builds a tension. And I wondered how you survived that, or what were your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, in those cases, I'm just bringing the question into the room. I'm not there to I can't like tell the directors get new dancers for me,
Mhm.
um, that. But of course, whenever I'm in any room, and particularly when I'm in Europe, I'm really like, where are the people of color? But like my attention right away goes
Mhm.
to them, and so I'm thinking about what that means in the room. And I'm also sensitive to the fact that the discourse around race in the United States cannot be easily mapped right onto to everywhere else. Yeah, I think I just brought it up, and I think when I say all of us in the piece, I'm not thinking just the people on the stage. I'm thinking about kind of beyond,
Mhm. Mhm.
and considering how people. I don't know. It's a nice thing for people to maybe have to think about, like, what is new, what is the
Mhm.
us
Mhm.
that we're talking about when we say us. And I think often protest movements hold within them a kind of utopic notion of the we or the us. And like, as you say, there's always exclusion. Um, and in the piece, the way that plays out a bit is like at a certain point in the piece, when they start to occupy the theater space, in a very simple way, some of the seats are better than others, right? Some
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
the spaces are you see better the situation. And actually in l'opera space, I think the better seats were higher, right?
Mhm.
The seats that are technically for the less privileged people become the more uh like the better perspective. And so there's a very simple sort of metaphorical gesture there for me that is meaningful about how we see and what we can see.
Mhm. Mhm.
I notice that when you're in the orchestra seating in a space like that, that you're directed to the front and you really can only see the front, and you kind of can ignore the
Mhm.
people behind you. And I just think that's like a very strange architectural hierarchy that's built into certain kinds of spaces.
That moment in the piece is also very. I only saw the video, and the video also brings something interesting, because suddenly the audience is very much filmed, and what they do in relation to the dancers become extremely visible, and you have those people that completely turn away from protecting themselves from the apparent, sweat and lusciousness of the movements, and while the others are um,
Yeah.
clapping, coming with becoming entrained by
Yeah.
the gesture, and that sort of reminding of the motricity engaged in witnessing feels very important. And like the simple trick you use, which is the release of the of the unicorn
Yeah.
balloon.
The balloons. Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's simple and childish, and at the same time, it means that the witnesses cannot not move.
Yeah.
They have to interact a little bit. Um, I wanted to circle around this tenderness as vandalism idea, or this idea that because I feel that the gestures that are invoked are in another tone than the usual insurrectionary image, and how, and so I'm curious on the process of movement making, how that came out out of the May 68 images, because they're somehow different. So
Yeah, I think in as much as I kind of love the ferociousness or the sort of fire of protest, it's a little predictable, you know, choreographically. You know, it's like there's the police, this wall of police usually, and then there's the kind of chaos of the protest, and then there's this kind of approach, and then sometimes there's a mix, but then it's like, you know, there's a very it's like a very binary thing that happens in that regard. Or there's, you know, horrible choreographies where the police surround the protesters. You know, there's all kinds of tactics that, you know, that have kind of a military assignation or association.
Right.
I think there is a kind there, you know, I think there's a time to be like, you know, when we go there, you can go there. But there's also something, you know, queerness also invites us into thinking about like an insidiousness of intimacy, like, or this kind of a way that you can kind of, you know, just by being a queer person or a trans person, you are threatening. Like literally, you don't even have to even be like, I'm gay, like, but you could be walking down the fucking street and people see you as dangerous, you know, and to me that exactly. And I feel like this is also something I learned when I was quite young. I mean, I didn't realize I was learning it as a child, but I was learning it as a child. And then certainly when I became more aligned with activist activity, I was like, oh wow, just being here threatens people. So that's a thought. And then you know, I think there is something about kind of how you think about the distance between people and how proximity and or the space between people is quite charged. And that's something that we spoke about a lot when we were building the work. We did a lot of improvisations in the first couple of weeks of the process, where I was kind of bringing them into this state of thinking of themselves. They're like, you're in a state of kind of wonder about yourself in a space. Like there's almost this kind of like, what am I? Who am I? Where am I? And then when you interact with someone else, I would bring in this idea of the problem of relation, which is a phrase that I was kind of working with, or still kind of work with a lot. But what is it to come into proximity with someone else, right? I thought about how in 68 it was like what the students wanted to have co-ed dorms, you know, which is such a kind of like basic sounding kind of thing to us now. But for me, what that sort of talks about is like this idea of like the danger of proximity, you know, and the specter of sexuality on top of that. And of course the sort of problematics of gender. But like, so I feel like there was something about playing with this idea of the proximity and how people approach each other, and then the sort of sensuality and also discovery in real time of what it is. You know, often in dance, when bodies come together, it's like there's an immediate understanding and agreement of what they're doing together, and it's often around manipulation, or it's often about a very kind of one-sided, I'm more powerful, I will move you around, you will respond to me, right? This is also, of course, the sort of legacy of ballet duets. And here I was like, well, what other kind of textures can we explore? that when you approach someone, you don't actually know what's going to happen, but you have a feeling about this person. And part of that feeling is erotic. Part of that feeling is just curiosity. Part of that feeling is mixed. It's like, yes, maybe, no, yes, okay, maybe, like I think that that's something that I wanted to sort of allow into the room and bring them into a state of working physically with each other around that, at least for the first like 20-25 minutes of the piece.
Mm. My mind jumps back to that word that you didn't want to use, the chaos.
Yeah.
And to the because I'm thinking of that moment in Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic, where she talks about the erotic as coming from that god Eros, the Greek god Eros, who she ascribes as son of chaos, which in
That's nice.
Greek mythology, there's two Eros that are available. There's the Eros that is the son of Zeus and Aphrodite, and his function is to perpetuate the heterosexuality between gods, and be a vigil over this reproduction. But there's this primordial Eros, this first Eros that is the first, like the second god in the Theogonia, and his function is to go deep inside of the other gods and bring about what they are not yet. And so it's so gorgeous. And I mean, so I'm thinking of that as so basically Eros goes into chaos and brings what is not chaos, which is Gaia, which is the earth, the organized reality. And he goes into Gaia and he brings Uranus, which is the sky, etc. But I'm thinking of this Audre Lorde idea of erotic as that function, not of heterosexual coupling, not of sexual or like a reproductive sexuality, but more like this power of expressing what is yet not said, what is kept inside and silenced by technologies of the pornographic body, which, as a ballet dancer, the pornographic body is, the erect.
Sure.
I mean, in a way, you could say it's everywhere. It's everywhere in the when the first scene of the piece. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but the first scene of the piece where they are standing in this semicircle, and you can, I read this as, oh, this is the scene where we get to see the choreography that the ballet expects of these bodies, which is held onto themselves, like they have to keep their weight from flowing into the space, so they have to but suddenly there's another reading that happens, which is, oh, it's a circle, oh, it's people that are presenting movements to each other. So there's a undoing of the veneer of the surface of the erect position in favor of something that is more spilling, that is more and that is more maybe contaminating, in the sense that you were referring to, in the sense like, oh, there's a presence that leads to something else, and that might call others to fold with us, or to sweat with us.
I want to catch a couple things. One is, my resistance to the word chaos is because it's often associated with random, and I don't think that anything that happens in the piece is random, there is improvisation, there are surprises, but it's all held within a kind of, there's a score, there's a kind of structure that's happening, and so the chaos, or the sense of chaos is often referred to as a kind of uncontrollable activity, or multi-directional activity that has no sense of itself. And I don't think that that's what's happening. I think there is multi-directional activity, but that there is an understanding, and there's understanding and not knowing, right? It's there's multiple textures around knowing that are proposed choreographically in the work,
and a clear presence as well, like a clear attention.
And part of that is because I think the dancers are so incredibly trained, and they're so beautifully, they're so, one of the things that is often forgotten is that all dancers, regardless of the style, one of the things that you're constantly training is your awareness, your ability to perceive the space around you, because you have to, especially if you're doing fancy ass dancing and you have to suddenly land in someone's arms. Like, you have to really understand space. And so these dancers completely understand it, which is part of why we were able to go to this great place. So I just want to kind of capture that. The second thing you're saying about the erotic is so beautiful. And I think it's like, what I also hear in that is the way that desire disrupts order, desire, I often talk about how, being a queer person, I understood myself as a queer person before I had the words to understand myself. So this kind of idea that language creates meaning is not complete for me, because I felt myself a certain way before someone was like, you are a da 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 da, like, before there was a taxonomy that I could attach myself to. I had a felt sense of the truth of my body and of my place, partly because of how people were reacting to me, right? So there was also kind of an affect that I was tapping into, of like, oh, I seem to do something in this room, or I seem to do something in this room, right? Later, the words came. So I think it's really interesting to think about how desire disrupts an expectation of how something should unfold. And I also learned that quite young, right? And how desire creates like rupture in family, or in society. Or I remember driving when I was a kid. I wasn't driving, my mother was driving us to the airport to pick up my father, and I was looking at the window, and this is in New York, and I saw two men kissing in a park. It was like a brief moment. It was in the 1970s, and I remember just being like thrown totally out of my understanding of car ride, airport, dad, mother, sister. Like, the whole matrix of where I was just suddenly cracked open into this other space of like, there are these two people, and they're having this whole other life. And I, without even realizing it, needed that moment, to start to identify myself to myself. So I feel like that's in there. And then I forgot the third thing you were talking about was so interesting as well, and I wanted to comment on it, but I can't remember what it is.
I'm thinking of that moment in the uses of the erotic where Lord says that's the only definition she gives. Go on. Yeah.
No, I remember you talk about the circle. See, for me, I see that circle, and I maybe in the room you would feel it slightly differently. I really see it as like a space of witness and the space of potentiality, right? This, and also we get a moment to really take in their costumes and kind of see them almost as this kind of color game and textural pattern game, because, I just want to shout out Martine Augsburger, who created the costumes with me, and she's the in-house costume person at Ballet de Lorraine, and she was incredible to work with. So I feel like it's also just, it's both the sense of there's an order, there's an understanding of like the dancer, but we spent some time talking about what it is to just stand without a forwardness, but to stand feeling your heels on the ground, feeling the back of your body, to both sort of understand the sort of crackle of possibility while not imposing a forward movement, a forward narrative movement. So that took some time just to get that, because I think they were quite used to sort of going. And I was like, you don't have to go anywhere. You can hold where you are. So just wanted to sort of name that that's how I experienced that part.
As you were talking about the pre-naming state, I was thinking of that other passage of the uses of the erotic where Lord says, the erotic is the measure between the beginning of our sense of self and the chaos of our deepest feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that there's the for me, the beginning of our sense of self is connected to that moment of the naming, the identity that is available and that is categorizable. That moment is important, but the erotic is right before, when the chaos of our deepest feeling, the seeing of a gay couple in the street, brings about a new sense of possibility and potential that you are also describing with that circle, which is the welling of something that is not yet, and the idea that that is what is between us. And I feel how deeply political that orientation towards the not yet, rather than the given, and how sort of a through line that traverse identity politics as they are available, which are necessary to name our oppressions, but sometimes difficult to use and lever as gathering or collective agitations. This idea of a sort of pre-individuated self that you that is felt in the agitation is quite sort of an antidote or a source to which to connect, which you could say life or desire, or there's many ways of describing it. And I feel I reconnect that moment of standing, to which in my choreographic culture was also connected to the this Steve Paxton small dance of standing, which he designed actually as he was teaching dance in Black women or Black young girl high school in California in '67. Apparently, that's where the first event of the small dance occurred in his transmission. And this practice of interrupting action in order to make surface what is already active in the relationship to the environment, in particular to the earth, I feel is extremely potent as a way of like, oh yeah, we are already agitated. We do not need to add any motion particular, but except for pulse, fingering the pulse. No, is that the putting the finger, checking the pulse, the pulsation that is already active, and this so there's a sorry, making a connection also to this amazing short paper by Mel Chen, who is a linguist. They wrote that book called Animacies, and in this short paper called Agitation, they are attentive to the fact that queer presences, racialized presences that are not considered to be part of the hegemonic are often read as hyperkinetic.
Oh yeah, totally.
People that are out of place are of excessive movement. If they are standing, it's already too much.
Oh yeah, I mean, you see it in the United States. I mean, you see it. That's the classic thing with the Colin Kaepernick, the athlete who kneeled, and people went crazy. And then there's Black activists who are like, you don't want us to kneel, you don't want us to dance, you don't want us to stand, and then you have people being killed in their own homes. You don't want us to sleep, you don't want us to run. what is allowed. You know, there's like all action is seen as kinetic, or even stillness is perceived as kinetic. So I absolutely hear that, and I agree with you. I think that, you know, I really do believe this thing that, like, you know, movement is always there, whether it's movement of thought, movement of feeling, movement of, you know, just somatic, you know, autonomic processes that we're not tapped into. There's always movement, and stillness, or I mean, I don't want to, like, I'm not trying to throw stillness under the bus here, but like, but order, you know, I talk about this in my teaching, like, you know, what is it that we teach children? Sit, get in lines, you know. We train people into order when their actual natural, or sort of often their sort of primary inclination is to activity. And so really what we learn when we're young is a series of repressions, and it's not about, it's of course we're learning things like coordinating, you know, how to put our clothes on, how to tie shoes, you know, these different kinds of things, but like really there's this kind of like, we learn how to stop doing what we're doing. And then that was certainly true for me. And then later in life, if we're lucky, we are invited into spaces of movement, but you see a lot of people that this idea of movement becomes really like embarrassing for them. This idea of taking up space becomes embarrassing for them, or is de facto read as excessive. I taught this class yesterday here at University of Colorado Boulder. I was a guest artist in a class that's looking at dance and popular culture, and we started the class, and I led them through a very short section of my deep aerobics practice, which is this kind of absurdist aerobics thing that I did for 10 years. And it was fun, and it went well, but you really see the children who are kind of like, what the hell are we doing? Like, why do I have to do this thing? And I'm like, we're bouncing, you know, like, we're not, I'm not asking you to like pirouette or, you know, do anything fancy, but just go up and down. And it's fascinating to me to see sort of the, like, the resistances, or the, like, I don't want to do something foolish. I don't want to be seen doing something silly. And I'm like, yeah, but silliness is so powerful. I mean, that's the thing. Again, I learned in Queer Nation, it's like we would do these very silly demonstrations, and they were so fun. Or we would make these silly chants. You know, during the war, we would say things like "hair care, not warfare." You know, or it was just like, just so ridiculous. Or sodomize, don't militarize. You know, these amazing, like, rhymes. And because again, there's something about the disruption of propriety that is really powerful and important, especially because we're basically walking from institutional context to institutional context to institutional context all the time. And each one of those spaces is coded with a series of repressions, particularly of movement. Yeah.
I'm thinking of the contagiousness of laughter, and in a society that is based on an immunological premise of the separation between our systems, especially, I mean, it's true on a kinetic level, and the technology of the chair and the table that is so connected to, you know, the from school to factory in the 19th century, and the ability to bring the attention in a very limited space. So this containment of the individual is, of course, threatened by the contagiousness of the erotic and of laughter, which are two great ways of undoing this pretense separation. And that's why they are so key to weird form of activism, or untraditional forms of activism that are making room for some other kind of presence. When you talked about Kaepernick, I thought of this other image that is beautifully commented upon. Ooh, we are 45 minutes. Thank you, Jay. In Kevin Kwashi's The Sovereignty of Quiet. It's a
Mm,
beautiful
I
book.
know this
And
book.
in the
Yeah.
beginning of that book, Kevin Kwashi is talking about the 1968 Olympic Games
Mm.
and the
Black Power.
fist, the Black Power. And so, and Kevin Kwashi attracts our attention to the fact that often what is named is the fist,
Yeah.
is the protest as insurrection. And he says, but often what is not remarked is that their eyes are closed and their heads
Mm.
are bowed, and what they are bringing into the public space is a form of quietness, is a form of orientation to the
Spirit.
inward, to the spiritual. They are, I mean, one of them has that doesn't have their shoes, so it's also a form of connection to the earth or to the environment again. So there's something
Mm.
again, this idea that there's a presence, there's a political presence that that is of another form, of another shape, that is brought by queer, Black, often also indigenous movements, which
Yeah.
are orienting towards another mode of being public
Yeah.
as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that. I love that. I mean, I love that book, and I love that image in that book. And I think that I think it's interesting. Like I'm sort of realizing that choreographically, I'm always kind of moving between the two textures of the power or the presence of just a person in a space, and then the
Mm,
sort of extraordinary range of movement that's held within
mm,
not just a person, but a group of persons, a society of people. Although I've explored it in my work both in solo form with my own performing, and then with people, and you know, after I made the piece in France, I made the next piece I made was called This Bridge Called My Ass,
mhm,
which was for six Latinx performers, and and the whole first 45 minutes of the piece. So, you know, I had done with Cela Nous Concerne Tous, like the first 20 minutes is an improvisational score based on something else that happens in the piece. And then with the piece I made after, it was the whole first 45 minutes were a very elaborate improvisational score. And then the other part of the piece is a telenovela, Spanish soap opera, which is like, you know, set and known, but also gets kind of
mm,
crazy. But yeah, I felt like I was pushing even further and further into the like
yeah.
starting from this place of the kineticism. Um, Even in the piece that I'm making here with students, it's funny, it's interesting for me to track. And I
Mhm,
feel it's funny because I'm feeling the desire now to return to quiet, to return to
mm,
stillness,
mm,
or something. I think the next project will have more presence of that potentially inside of it, because I feel like in a way they're both the same. Like there's an activity in both states. But I think with Cela Nous Concerne Tous, precisely because of the sort of context of the French bourgeois public, you know, coming to the theater, there was a kind of interest in the activity and in the silliness
mhm,
that could
mhm,
emerge, especially in towards the last 15 minutes of the piece. Yeah.
mhm. It's interesting. It connects me back to the questions in does abstraction belong to white people? Because I feel that it's when you in different places, and notably, I think when you speak of B.B. Miller's
Mm.
uh, way of using abstraction when she describes the Emmett Till photograph, and you say
Yeah.
something like abstract but inexorably personal.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's something in, there's a way of investing stillness that can be abstract but inexorably personal, in the
Hmm.
sense of letting surface, letting the welling of the intimate part of that immobility, and not only, you know, becoming a figure that doesn't move, which is, you know, the summum of white abstraction, in the
Yeah.
sense of I'm just going to show a body that doesn't move. But no,
Yeah.
it's not about just showing a body that doesn't move, but by showing this body that doesn't move, it becomes a marked historical transient body of other forces, and that becomes the political strong statement.
Absolutely, both in the moment of its experience, but then also the idea through time, through history, through then B.B. Miller growing up as a person, right? Through and any artist kind of moving through life, and as you know, I'm thinking. I mean, the image is coming to mind is very different than that right now, but I'm thinking about when my father was in the hospital in 2010. I've been talking about it a lot, so I think it's somehow in my
Mm.
consciousness right now very strongly. And just the sort of abstraction of that experience, you know, what it is to suddenly be in a hospital room for 12 hours with the person who's like one of the most key figures in any kind of conception of self or matrix of self and family, who is now completely incapacitated, you know, in a coma. That he was in the hospital for about 5 months, in and out of surgeries and comas and seizures, and it was just a horrific experience, really. And there were some times that it would be like 4 in the morning, and I'm just standing by his bed, and it's like, I don't even know that room is real. Like, I don't even know that this person is real. Or sometimes, one time he started speaking, and he was totally in like he was like, is it 1943? He was talking about the club in Colombia, which is where my mother, my father are from Colombia, South America, and there was just this whole other sort of hallucinatory space that was invoked, which of course, you know, as an artist, I'm like, this is fascinating. You know, like, I'm sort of intrigued, and like, yeah, Dad, we're in the club, you know. And then of course, as a person who's trying to understand the tether to reality and what a future could mean in relationship to this changing body, it was quite upsetting, you know. So this way in which stillness and activity were sort of playing out in this moment has, I think, imprinted me so strongly, where at any point when I'm, you know, me even right now speaking to you through this bizarre context of the Zoom call, where I'm suddenly like, wait, this is my body. Like, I'm feeling my legs, like I'm feeling this bed, see this room behind me. I know there's space behind me, but we're also somehow disjointed. We're out of time. We're out of, you know, this will be seen later than we're actually doing it. You know, this sense of place becomes put into question, I guess is what I'm trying to say, really. And as a maker, that's something that I think I'm constantly sort of returning to, and how choreography is potentially a frame of inquiry or a question of placeness.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have 1,000 things to say to you. My heart is full of futurity.
Futurity. Yeah.
um, yeah. Thank you so much,
Thank
Miguel.
you. Such a beautiful conversation. Thank you for
It,
the
uh,
generosity of your attention to the work. I really appreciate it.
and thank you for the Protect Trans Kid as a magnificent use of your chest as protest.
My chest, my protesty chest.
Okay, Jay, if you want to cut the recording, I think we're